For Mr. Peter, thank you for joining us today. We all are so excited that you'll be here with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, to all participants, I kindly ask you to turn on your camera and your microphone if necessary. Kepada semua partisipan, saya mohon untuk menyalakan kamera dan juga mikrofon jika diperlukan. Terima kasih. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good morning, everyone. I am Rahmatia, student from Highland University. Will be lead this morning webinar. As has been stated, our webinar today is about history and social change in Maluku Island from colonial to democracy. Selamat pagi teman-teman, saya Rahmatia, mahasiswa dari Universitas Highland Ternate yang akan memimpin berjalannya webinar pada pagi hari ini. Seperti yang sudah ditetapkan, webinar kita pada pagi hari ini yaitu membahas tentang sejarah dan perubahan sosial di Pulau Maluku dari kolonial ke demokrasi. Thank you for the presenter, Mr. Peter Lape, and I am so sorry for mispronounce your name, to the DSC team, and to all beloved participants that joined this webinar. Next, I respectfully welcome the chairman of the HMT. Terima kasih kepada presenter Tuan Peter Lape, maaf jika saya salah menyebutkan namanya. dan kepada DSC Team, dan juga kepada seluruh partisipan yang telah bergabung pada webinar pagi hari ini. Selanjutnya, saya persilahkan dengan hormat kepada Ketua Umum HMT untuk menyampaikan sambutannya. Kepada Ketua Umum, saya persilahkan.
Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, selamat pagi kepada teman-teman semua. The Excellency Mr. Peter, Profesor Departemen Antropologi Universitas Washington. Thank you for your time. Dan juga terima kasih kepada presenter dan moderator yang terhormat Adinda Rahma. Dan juga kepada teman-teman panitia yang sudah menyelenggarakan acara ini. Terima kasih kepada Bung Fandi selaku Sekjen HMT yang selama ini berkecimpung dalam hal-hal diskusi ilmiah. Oke, singkat saja dari saya sebelumnya terkait diskusi history and social change in Maluku Island from Colonial to demokrasi. Bagi saya ini adalah diskusi yang sangat penting untuk mengembangkan wawasan bagaimana sih perpindahan pandangan dari pandangan kolonial ke demokrasi di masyarakat Maluku Utara sekarang yang masih menggunakan adat-adat budaya, salah satunya adalah kesultanan. Dengan hal tersebut menurut kami adalah penting adanya supaya menggambarkan bagaimana sebenarnya ketetapan diri kita dalam melihat pandangan kolonial to demokrasi. Saya pikir itu saja singkat dari saya supaya jangan kita berlama-lama di sambutan. Karena yang paling terpenting adalah penjelasan atau materi yang akan nanti disampaikan oleh Bapak Profesor Peter. And then thank you for Mr. Peter for your time. I hope the discussion to be continued for the next discussion. Dan juga kepada seluruh peserta harap untuk bisa menyimak sama-sama dan mari kita hikmatkan ini diskusi dengan baik. Saya pikir itu saja dari saya, Mbak Rahma. Cukup. Saya kembalikan lagi ke
Thank you for the chairman of the HMT. Next, here later, we are about to listen to the direct presentation from Mr. Peter Lape, the professor from Anthropology Department at the University of Washington. Selanjutnya, kita akan mendengarkan presentasi langsung dari Tuan Peter Lape, Profesor Antropologi dari Universitas Washington. But before that, to all participants, please pay attention. There are some provisions for our webinar today. The first is when the presenter delivers the material, participants are not allowed to interrupt. Second, the question and answer session will be open after the presenter has delivered the material. Third, there will be a limit on the question and answer session. And fourth, kindly to maintain the calm during the presentation. Kepada semua partisipan, mohon perhatiannya karena di sini ada beberapa ketentuan yang harus dipatuhi. Yang pertama yaitu ketika pemateri menyampaikan materinya, partisipan dilarang untuk mengganggu atau untuk menginterupsi. Yang kedua, sesi tanya jawab akan dibuka setelah pemateri selesai menyampaikan materinya. Yang ketiga, akan ada batasan untuk sesi tanya jawab. Jadi nanti dibatasi 3 atau 2 penanya saja. Yang terakhir, saya meminta dengan hormat untuk menjaga ketenangan selama presentasi berlangsung. Okay, next I welcome to our presenter, Mr. Peter Lape, to deliver the presentation. To Mr. Peter, time is yours.
Okay, selamat pagi semuanya dari Seattle. Sekarang di sini sudah malam.
Selamat pagi.
So, maaf, saya akan pakai bahasa Inggris untuk presentasi saya karena bahasa Indonesia saya agak jelek. Jadi saya harap semuanya bisa mengerti presentasi ini dalam bahasa Inggris. Kalau ada masalah bahasa atau lain-lain nanti dalam waktu QA mungkin kita bisa menjelaskan semuanya. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank thank you all for the kind invitation to join your group today, especially to Pak Reza, who's been very patient with me as we've had to change the dates a couple of times. So apologies for the changes, and I'm glad you could all join this morning. So I've been working in Indonesia on and off for the past 25 years, primarily in Maluku. And I'm an archaeologist, so my area of expertise is the material record of history, so the material things that people left behind. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research, archaeological research, which has primarily been in the Banda Islands of central Maluku. So I will show you some of the work I've done there, and we can discuss sort of the long range of history. One thing to say before I start is that I often give this presentation to audiences in America, where people are not so familiar with the history. So some of this may be very, very familiar to you all who probably have known this since you were small children. So apologies for some of the material might be rather simple for you, but I hope we can get into a more complex discussion, especially in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is that all visible to everybody?
Apakah sudah jelas untuk semuanya tampilannya?
Jelas.
Sudah.
Yes? Okay.
Sangat jelas.
Okay, so this is a photograph looking from Pulau Ai in the Banda Islands back towards Pulau Gunung Api and the other central Banda Islands. So I'll be talking a lot about the Banda Islands, which I'm sure is a place that many of you already know a lot about. The theme of this talk is to talk about whether archaeology can tell us more about the past than we already know from historical documents and memories of people. So as an archaeologist, I believe archaeology can often reveal hidden histories that were things that were not written down and did not make it to archives. And that's particularly important in colonial situations where often the written archives are completely dominated by, say, European writers, and we lose the voice of Indonesian or local people in what happened in the past. So archaeology is a way to access this other side, or these other voices in history. So here's my talk today. I'll review the maritime spice trade history briefly. I think this will be very familiar to you all, so I'll go quickly. I'll talk about what archaeology data can add, and then I'll discuss how this knowledge is valuable today in the year 2023. And I think it's interesting your group is looking at this history up to democracy, and I think there's a lot we can discuss with regards to this history and the current status of democracy. So this is a map of the world looking at how spices moved from Asia to the Middle East and to Europe up until about 1500 AD or CE. So this is often known as the Silk Road. The green lines on this map are the overland routes that brought spices across Central Asia into the Middle East. And there's also the red lines are the maritime spice route, where spices were carried mostly by Asian or Indian ships to the Middle East and then on into the Mediterranean. So this is the situation up until the early modern period, about 1500 AD, so about 600 years ago. Then, really beginning with the Portuguese after 1512, and then the Dutch after about 1600, a new route was opened directly from Europe to Indonesia. And it required a new kind of ship that could do more long-distance travel and carry enough food and water for hundreds of crew for many months. So this technology allowed a more direct connection between the spice-producing islands of Indonesia and Europe, the markets of Europe. And the lower picture is a picture of the Batavia shipwreck, which wrecked just off of Western Australia in 1629. And that ship is in this wonderful museum in Fremantle, Australia, that preserves a lot of the technology and culture of these big ships. So where I work in the Banda Islands, we're the sole source of nutmeg and mace, so pala and bunga pala. So I think many of you probably already know this history very well. But up until the late 1700s, Banda and Maluku were the only places on Earth that produced these very expensive and important spices. So they were in demand in Europe first, more as a medicine. They were considered to be effective medicines to prevent plague or disease from spreading. And then later they become used by wealthy and elite individuals to demonstrate their wealth in feasts. So these were exotic, expensive ingredients, food ingredients that could help wealthy, rich people show their wealth. And up to today, nutmeg continues to be an important ingredient in things like Coca-Cola, Starbucks drinks. It's often used in cleaning agents, so it's still very much highly consumed across the world. So Eastern Indonesia, or Maluku, was the source of at least 2 or 3 spices. So cloves, cengkeh, come from North Maluku, so particularly the islands of Ternate and Tidore. And then nutmeg and mace comes from the Banda Islands down here in central Maluku. So focusing now in on the Banda Islands here. I'm guessing some of you have probably traveled to the Banda Islands before. They're a little bit difficult to get to, and they're very small islands. So made up of about 7 inhabited islands and then a few small islands that are uninhabited. So when we talk about the history of the Banda Islands, this person here is probably one of the most important people in the history of the Banda Islands. So Jan Pietersen Koen, he was involved in the Dutch East India Company first as a soldier and then later as a commander. He was in Banda in 1609 and he witnessed an attack by Bandanese people on leaders of a Dutch trading expedition. And he survived that attack. And many people think 10 years later he came back with feelings of revenge, and he launched a massive military invasion of the Banda Islands. And this military invasion occurred in 1621. So we just had the 400th year anniversary of this military invasion or massacre. So last year or 2 years ago now. And there was a lot of commemoration in Banda and other places about this incredibly important event in Banda history. So what happened is Koen brought over 1,000 soldiers from Netherlands, from Japan, from other parts of Southeast Asia, several dozen ships, and proceeded to invade all the islands and capture all native Bandanese people. Many were killed and some escaped. And at the end of it, after several months, most people estimate out of about 15,000 original inhabitants, only about 1,000 were left in the Banda Islands. And those that were left became enslaved by the Dutch East India Company. They were mostly women and children, so most of the men either were killed or left. And so the culture today of Banda many people trace to the survivors of this massacre. And in many cases, women's culture was, from the pre-massacre times, was preserved better than men's culture. So things like songs, food traditions, and things that women would have carried. So Jan Pietersen Koen has, if you go to the Netherlands, his legacy is nowadays considered bad legacy. And so, for example, there's a statue of him in Haarlem in the Netherlands that was, there's been efforts to tear down the statue. There's been a lot of protests around the statue. So many people in the Netherlands feel like this history should not be celebrated, but it should be regretful history. So these days, this history plays an important political role in the way that people in the Netherlands and people in Indonesia think about colonialism and democracy. So if we look now after 1621, so after this massacre, and you look, this is a map of the main population center in Banda Neira Island. What the Dutch East India Company did was they divided the island into these plantations. So each of these squares here was a plantation or a kabun, and then the number here, 16 Zeilen. So this is the number of people that would work on that plantation. So you can see there's different numbers, 16, 20 over here, 20 over here, 28. And this is the town here, so the commercial center. So these workers were mostly brought from Western Indonesia, so particularly Bali, but also later Java. So these were, at first they were slaves, and then later they were not that dissimilar from like transmigrasi movement of populations. So basically relatively poor people from Java and Bali would be brought, and they could make enough money to gain their freedom by working on these plantations. So today in Banda, a lot of the traditions are Javanese and Balinese. So there's a lot of people's names are Javanese names or Balinese names. So a lot of the food traditions, music, things like that have a lot of influence from Java and Bali. So one question, and this is where archaeology comes in, is what can we learn about Banda before 1621? So before we have a European presence in the islands, what can we learn about what was happening there? And can that teach us anything about how history unfolded in Banda? So we actually have very limited documents or maps from this pre-1621 era. This is probably the first known map of the Banda Islands. It dates to 1599. It's a very interesting map. It preserves a lot of place names that have been lost and changed. If you look at the details, like here, there's some walls built around the town. You can see houses. So there's a lot to see and unpack in this map. But we have very few documents like this. There's not much to go on for this pre-1621 era. I actually spent a lot of time in Portugal and Spain and Netherlands and England looking in libraries and archives for any information about Banda pre-1621 and also Jakarta, the National Archives in Jakarta. Very, very little information. So this is where I believe that archaeology can fill out this picture of the pre-1621 time period in Banda. So let's take a look at some of the things that we get from archaeology. So first of all, these are just some of the people involved. So I work with Indonesian scholars and students from lots of different partnerships from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Universitas Patimura and Ambon, UI, and these days I'm working primarily with what used to be the National Archaeology Research Center and is now part of BRIN, and I'll talk about them a little bit. So that's my current partnership. But I brought students from all over Indonesia to work here, as well as American students and students from Philippines, Thailand, and other parts of Southeast Asia. The bottom picture is actually high school students from the high school in Banda Nera. So I also work with younger students as well. The archaeology is very much a community effort. So archaeology, if any of you have had experience working on an archaeology excavation or digging, it's a very public activity and lots of community interest. So we involved community members, small children up to old people, always were working on our teams to help us do the archaeology. So one of the first places we excavated was this village called Lautaka, which is on Banda Nera Island. And we found evidence of a wall. Here, if you can see my cursor. So this wall was buried by volcanic ash, so you can't see it today unless you dig the ash away. But right here in this area, the wall was about 3 meters tall. So very similar probably to the wall that you see in this early map. And this wall we estimate was built right around 1300 AD, so 700 years ago. So several hundred years before any European visitors made it to the Banda Islands. We also found a lot of evidence for conflict or social difference in the Banda Islands. So one example is I was very interested in the history of Islam in Banda. When the Portuguese first get there in 1512, they ask the Bandanese, how long have you been Muslim? And they answer, about 50 years. And this sounds about right with what we know about Islam in Indonesia, especially Eastern Indonesia. So estimating about 1450 AD for first presence of Islam in Banda. But if we look at some of the different archaeological sites, there were some places that, for example, continued to consume pig or babi. And so we find a lot of pig bones, even in a later time period, in some places. And then other villages, there is no pig bones at all. So we interpret this to mean that the arrival of Islam in Banda was not all the islands all at once, but it slowly moved from village to village in a slow process. And there was times when there'd be a Muslim village next to a non-Muslim village. And there's some evidence that these two places had conflict. In fact, the Dutch record a battle between Lautaka and Nera in the upper left picture here, which when we did the archaeology, those two places have a very different history of pig consumption. So this is interesting. So this tells us now something about the dynamics of social change in Banda before Europeans got there. We also, of course, have a lot of evidence for trade. Particularly from pottery remains. So we find pottery from Thailand, Vietnam, China, of course, and then pottery from other islands in Maluku as well. And this has been the subject of my research in the last few years, is to trace the Maluku pottery to particular islands in Central and North Maluku to see if we can reconstruct trade connections from Banda to other Moluccan islands. We also have some very deep time evidence from archaeology. So this site here, so this is me standing in the bottom of an excavation pit with my colleague, Dr. Daud Tanudirjo, who's at Gajah Mada University. So he's also an archaeologist, maybe very well known in Indonesia. Where our feet are at the bottom of this hole, those layers of dirt are about 3,500 years old. And so we can, looking at the layers of dirt, we can retrieve pottery from those and know something about what people were eating, where they were trading, and other things over this very long time period. So this adds another dimension to our history that's far, far older than historical documents. The oldest documents we have in Indonesia are maybe 1,000 years old. This now pushes us back to 3,000 plus years old. So from that, what we call Neolithic, which is this about 3,000-year-old layers, we find earthenware pottery with really interesting designs. We find a lot of pig. We find stone tools that are made of obsidian, which is a volcanic, almost like a glass, very, very sharp, that was probably brought from a different island. And we see other stone tools like adzes. These were used probably for wood carving, maybe boat building. Chert, another stone that was used for tools. And even things like games that maybe small children were playing. So these objects tell us a lot about life 3,500 years ago in the Banda Islands. Several years ago, I became very interested in food, particularly plant food. So we had some evidence of course, fish and pig and other animals, birds, but we didn't know much about the plants that people were eating. So I invited my colleague, Dr. Kyung-na Lee, who is from Korea, to come. She's an expert on plant remains in archaeology, and she trained Nia here, who is now currently an archaeologist with Brin in Kalimantan, on how to process and analyze samples to uncover plant foods. And we learned some interesting things. So from this very early time period, we found a lot of evidence of people eating yams, as well as sago, and we have very early evidence of use of nutmeg. So this is the oldest nutmeg we've currently found on Earth, so 3,500-year-old nutmeg. So this really pushes back the use of spices into a very, very deep, early time. Very, very interesting. We also tried to find evidence for rice and taro, and we expected we might find taro, but there was no evidence for that, and definitely no evidence for rice. So this is a big debate in archaeology right now. When is the first rice in Indonesia? Some people used to think 3,500 years ago was the oldest rice. Nowadays, we're thinking actually it's maybe about 2,000 years ago. So still very much a debate. Okay, so this is a little bit more complicated archaeology data. What this graph is showing is these two lines show how many trading partners this one village had over time. So the bottom line here is years before now. So 3,500, 3,000, 2,500. And this tells you how many different trading partners were happening at that time. So the top line is the pottery trade, and the bottom line is pig trade. So we found that people were actually trading pigs from island to island, something that still happens in Maluku a little bit. So people will buy a pig from a different island, bring it on a boat, at least places that still eat pigs. So we analyzed the bones of the pigs that we found, the chemistry of those bones to figure out where those pigs were born, actually. Then the pottery line, we also did a different chemical analysis, and I think I have a picture of it here. Oh no, I think later in the talk I'll show you the machine that we used to do that. So we analyzed basically the geochemistry of the pottery pieces, and those have a fingerprint that can trace back to particular islands in Maluku. So I guess another thing to see here is now we see there's very much a dynamic story of trade in Maluku that's long before Europeans are present in Maluku. So this place has a very long history of active trade, at least in the region, thousands of years old. So spice trade was not a new thing that was brought by outsiders, Chinese or Europeans or Arabs. This is a thing that Indonesians have been practicing for thousands of years. So one of the things that we are looking at now is trying to reconstruct how the Banda Islands were connected to other parts of Maluku. So which islands were they trading with, and why? And how did those trade networks change over time? So this is kind of the big area that we're looking at. And we're trying to develop a database of pottery signatures from this whole area. So that's my current research right now. We also can use evidence from understanding language history. So there's many different languages spoken in Maluku. And looking at the relationships of languages to each other tells us something about the connections people have with other islands. Same with modern trade can tell us something about kind of modern, living traditions of connections that still exist today. I'm very interested in trading on boats and how that works. So I was able to join this man who owned this trading ship here in the background. So it's a sailing, uses a sail, also has a motor inside. And he had spent his whole life trading between Banda and Seram Island. And so he had a lifetime of experience of what it was like to actually move goods back and forth between these islands. So I'll just play you this very short video clip. This is a trip, you'll see a much skinnier me taking this trip about 25 years ago now. We spent 1 week on Pak Laade's ship. So it's just to give you a sense of what it's like. So here we're just starting out with the motor. We're leaving the Banda Islands on our way to Seram. It took about 24 hours to sail, and they're raising the sails. So this man built the ship by himself with wood that he cut down in the forest in Banda. So it was an amazing trip. I learned so much from him by talking to him and understanding what it was like to actually move around and move goods between the islands. So in 2015, our team went to East Seram, so the kind of the closest part of Seram to the Banda Islands, and we collected clay from many different sources here. We also did some archaeological excavations. So we're looking to see if pottery from Seram was what we're finding in Banda. So this is kind of what that work looked like. So we did a lot of surveying. We did some, here we're digging over here with this drill. So quick way to get down below into the lower layers of soil and collect. We also found some rock art sites here that were documented by one of my colleagues from Bryn. So also gives evidence of movement of people around. This art is very interesting. Now, of course, Indonesia has the oldest rock art in the world as of today. So rock art in Indonesia, now that we have new technology to get dates from rock art, we're finding Indonesia is a real center for rock art innovation, very, very old, maybe 40,000 years ago. In 2019, I did a trip here. So this is where we did the 2015 survey. 2019, we chartered a boat to go to all the small islands here between Seram and these are the K islands down here. So about 2 weeks on this trip. We chartered this boat. It was like a liveaboard diving tourist boat, but it was perfect for our archaeology team because we could live on the boat and eat our food there. And we had a small lab. And we discovered so many interesting sites on these small islands. So this is a cave site. This is a rock designed to catch water falling from the top of the cave as a water source. Very interesting pottery from these areas, from these smaller islands. These are what some of those islands look like. Lots of rock art, incredible archaeology. None of this has ever been studied by any archaeologists from Indonesia or elsewhere until 2019. We had the first research on these islands. This is a rock art from Kaimir Island. So my colleagues at Balai Arkeologi Maluku in Ambon did a research project here, and we have some radiocarbon dates for 23,000 years old for this rock art. Okay, so let me end with just some thoughts about why is this knowledge useful, or how can it be helpful for us? So this book came out in English last year, and I don't know if it's available in Indonesia yet. I know it's been translated into a few different other languages. Amitabh Ghosh is an anthropologist and historian who's written a lot of really interesting books about, especially about trade in the Middle East. His newest book is about the Banda Islands. And so his thesis is that Banda is a sort of parable for global crisis, and it really points to problems with capitalism and with climate change, and the way that Banda, the example of Banda and the way that the Dutch East India Company exploited Banda should be a warning to us now about how global capitalism is dangerous for our way of life. So kind of using Banda as more of a case study to communicate his ideas about the dangers that we're facing. I also think that in my experience, the heritage or the history of these places is incredibly valued by the people who actually live there. And often foreign researchers, I think, can miss this important thing. So people in the smallest, most remote islands were, of course, incredibly knowledgeable about their history. And that history is also valuable to them. They remember this history, and it serves a very important role in current society. So this is an example. This piece here, it's a bronze elephant that was probably made in Vietnam about 2,000 years ago. And it's kept as a treasure by this small village on a small island here in Southeast Maluku. And people have come to try to steal this bronze. It probably would be very valuable if you sold it. And people have tried to steal it or take it away. It always comes back, and it's protected by people and seen as this kind of icon of the village. So this connection, this trade connection from thousands of years ago, lives on as an important symbol for people today. Regional trade is still very important in Maluku, and of course in other parts of Indonesia too. So things like sago are still manufactured in Seram and then shipped to places like Banda, where sago does not grow. There's a lot of making of knives and metal implements on certain islands, and these are traded all around. So things like parang and pisau are made here and shipped out to other islands. So these trade connections are very, very much alive today. And then ritual or cultural traditions are also very, very strong in Maluku. So people remember songs, dances, ceremonies, and these continue to play this incredibly important role in how kids and small children learn to be Bandanese through these living traditions. So these are just some great kids that I met in Kaimir Island, where that rock art was. So these guys are future leaders of this island, and that history that they learn about since they're small children, this will be the foundation of their leadership and of how they help control how people survive on these very small islands. So I feel like this deep history is very, very useful for contemporary people. So I think we'll stop there. Terima kasih banyak semuanya for listening to me. I hope the English was okay. I also just want to thank all the people listed on this slide, my partners in Indonesia, without whom I could not do this work. So thank you.
Okay, thank you to Mr. Peter for the presentation. Maybe I might conclude a little bit about what Mr. Peter has delivered. Jadi apa yang disampaikan Mr. Peter tadi ada 3 poin. Yang pertama itu tentang sejarah pulau maritim dan perdagangannya. Yang kedua tentang data-data yang didapatkan oleh arkeolog. Dan yang ketiga yaitu apa yang mereka dapatkan atau para masyarakat di Banda Aceh ini dapatkan dari penemuan-penemuan bersejarah ini. Yang pertama dari sejarahnya sendiri itu para arkeolog sendiri menemukan bahwa adanya rute baru dari Eropa ke Indonesia dan juga beberapa rempah-rempah seperti pala dan cengkeh yang masih terjaga hingga saat ini. Juga terdapat perubahan signifikan dari para pekerja yang menjadi budak, mereka mencari uang dengan bekerja dan mengubah kehidupan mereka. Itu juga terjadi beribu tahun yang lalu. Selanjutnya untuk yang kedua yaitu para arkeolog di sana juga termasuk Mr. Peter, mereka bekerja sama dengan beberapa mahasiswa dari universitas yang ada di Indonesia, termasuk juga universitas yang ada di Filipina dan Thailand. Mereka juga menelusuri beberapa peninggalan benteng yang terdapat dan terkubur juga di Pulau Banda sendiri. Juga mereka menemukan bahwa pernah terjadi konflik dan juga sejarah Islam di Pulau Banda sekitar 50 tahun yang lalu. Para arkeolog ini juga termasuk Mr. Peter sendiri menemukan beberapa tulang babi yang terkubur selama puluhan tahun. Ini juga merupakan konsumsi dari masyarakat terdahulu sebelum Islam masuk ke Pulau Banda sendiri. Nah, terlepas dari itu, terdapat perdagangan yang menghubungkan Thailand, Vietnam, dan Cina juga Indonesia. Yang mana hal ini menjadi nilai tambah untuk negara kita sendiri, khususnya sebagai perdagangan rempah-rempah. Mereka juga menggali lubang yang berumur sekitar 2.500 tahun dan juga menemukan beberapa batu obsidian atau yang bisa dibilang juga batu-batu mulia, tulang babi, dan juga beberapa peninggalan benteng dan mainan zaman dahulu yang sering dimainkan oleh anak-anak. Nah, terlepas dari itu juga, masyarakat Banda juga mengelola beberapa tumbuhan dan juga memancing terlepas dari membudidaya pala. Para arkeolog dan juga Mr. Peter sendiri mencari bukti sejarah terkait penemuan pala sendiri. Dan sampai sekarang mereka masih mencari bukti-bukti tersebut untuk dikaitkan dan juga dipelajari lebih lanjut. Nah, untuk beberapa perdagangan yang terjadi juga, beberapa teman bisnis yang berkembang seiring berjalannya dengan waktu, orang-orang masih menggunakan tulang babi sebagai salah satu media perdagangan di Maluku dan juga di Pulau Banda sendiri. Dan itu masih terjadi hingga beberapa tahun belakangan. Namun, pada tahun-tahun dan juga sudah memasuki era 5.0 ini, masyarakat sudah mulai menggunakan mata uang atau beberapa barang-barang modern untuk dijadikan barang perdagangan. Namun terlepas dari itu, budaya dan juga ciri khas dari orang-orang terdahulu tetap mereka pertahankan. Seperti itu, baik itu musik, makanan, maupun adat. Sekian dari saya. Bagi para partisipan, jika ada yang ingin bertanya, tolong tekan tombol angkat tangan. Okay. For participants that are about to give questions, please press the hand raise button and don't forget to mention your name. Also, make sure that your question is clear and to the point. Untuk partisipan yang ingin memberikan pertanyaan, saya mohon untuk menekan tombol hand raise dan juga jangan lupa untuk menyebutkan namanya. Dan juga pastikan pertanyaan kalian to the point dan jelas. Saya persilahkan jika ada yang ingin bertanya. Bertanyanya bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia, nanti saya translate ke dalam bahasa Inggris. Jika ada yang ingin bertanya, silahkan bertanya dengan menekan tombol raise hand. Dipersilakan untuk bertanya dengan bahasa Indonesia, akan saya terjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Inggris.
I actually, while we're waiting for questions, could you tell me a little bit about your development study club?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Peter. Tertuju pada pihak DSC, Mr. Peter sendiri bertanya tentang perkembangan dari study club yang sedang berjalan. Pada pihak DSC, saya persilahkan.
Terima kasih, Kak Rama. Good morning from Indonesia, Pak Peter. And so I'm here speaking as representative of Department Study Club. We actually have no kind of strict structure or structure here, but I can tell you that Development Study Club is actually started as an initiative for the independent discussion platform, and we based our activity in East Java. We started since April 2021. Yeah, since the pandemic, because usually we attend discussions in university or in any other places, but because pandemic we cannot go anywhere, and we built this platform for everyone to meet and to present the research. But we want to focus the discussion in this platform in social politics or in Islam, in gender, and particularly from scholars who study about Indonesia. We do a lot of scholars, maybe like more well-known scholars like Kajian and others. But we want to bring more people to know about what's new about research on Indonesia. So we built this platform to try to reach as many scholars as possible to present their work in Development Study Club, and also to collaborate with universities or with student association like Himpunan Mahasiswa Tali Abu this time. I think Himpunan Mahasiswa Tali Abu is a friend of Reza Pandi, who is also from Maluku. I think they're more familiar with the topic, so we collaborate in this discussion. I hope that explains.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very interesting. Wonderful. So I see a question in the chat, which is asking for if my research also investigates how Indonesians from other islands or freedom fighters in Java perceive the situation in Banda. And actually, no, I don't have not done that kind of research. I'd be very interested to learn more about kind of perceptions of Banda from outside of, especially from Eastern Indonesia, so like places like Java. So that would be very interesting to bring into this story, I think. So one thing I'll say related to that is I'll be coming to Indonesia in October this year, going back to Banda with my colleagues from BRIN. And then in 1 year, also returning again with an international group. And there'll be lots of options for Indonesian students to join the research. So if anyone's interested in learning about archaeology and spending time in Banda, in about 1 year, we'll have some opportunities. So maybe you can, I can share my email and website if anyone's interested. You'd be welcome to join. So I see this other question in the chat. What is the main purpose of my coming all the way to Indonesia to research, especially in Banda? I get that question many times. So especially people in Banda say, because when I go to Banda, I have to, you know, I look like a farmer because I bring like a shovel and I'm very dirty all the time and working very hard, and they're used to, more familiar with like tourists coming from America, not people digging in the dirt and getting very dirty. So I get that question quite frequently. But more seriously, I've been interested in how European colonialism starts. So I wanted to understand like the very earliest days of European colonialism anywhere in the world. How did it unfold and why did it happen that way? And Banda just became a very important place to study that because it was so early. And people in Banda were already very connected to the international world. They're very sophisticated people. They weren't, you know, remote tribes people who had never had experience with outsiders. They knew a lot of outsiders, and yet colonialism unfolded in Banda in a very specific way. So I feel like there's a lot to learn from that place. I think it can teach all of us something about the world that we live in now, which is really a world, you know, post-colonial world. I think it's a place where we can study those origins. So thank you for that question. And Rama, I should probably give you time to translate my answers too. Oh.
Oke, jadi tadi pertanyaan dari Ferdian dijawab oleh Mr. Peter, yaitu Mr. Peter sendiri belum memulai penelitian tersebut. Namun, Mr. Peter akan tertarik untuk memulainya lagi pada bulan Oktober tahun ini. Beliau juga menawarkan bagi teman-teman yang tertarik untuk mengikuti penelitian terkait ini, agar nanti akan menghubungi Mr. Peter untuk ikut bergabung. Nah, untuk pertanyaan dari Sauti, Mr. Peter mengatakan bahwa dia tertarik dengan bagaimana orang-orang kolonial terdahulu melakukan perdagangan, dan juga penasaran bagaimana orang-orang terdahulu melakukan interaksi dengan orang-orang luar. Seperti itu. Okay, we got one more questions from Nazmi. Are there any difficulties or challenge in the term of interacting with the locals or understanding the custom there, and etc. when you are doing the research? Okay, Mr. Peter, time is yours.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Very good question. Yes, the answer is yes. Sometimes there are difficulties and challenges. Of course, you know, with the language barrier, I do, when I'm in Banda, I speak, you know, really Bandanese Malay. It's like a version of Bahasa Indonesia that's a very specific accent and dialect of Indonesian spoken in Banda that I've slowly learned over many years, but still sometimes we have misunderstandings. I think the biggest challenge in Banda actually is that people there now do not, because of after World War II, when Indonesia became independent nation, all the land in Banda was transferred to the national government. So people did not have private ownership of land. And land ownership is still a very difficult situation in Banda. So people do not have a clear ownership of their land. And sometimes when I'm doing my research, that situation makes it difficult. So I have to ask permission before I can do an excavation on a piece of land, and finding out who the legal owner of that land is can be sometimes I get involved in conflicts between two families who each think they own the land. And it can be very, very challenging to work out how to behave properly. But I'd say generally, since I've been working there for so long, I have very good friends in Banda and very good relationships with many, many people. People who I knew as small children are now in their 20s and becoming Kepala Desa, even things like that. So I feel a great love for the people there, and I'm constantly communicating with them and staying in touch with people and visiting as much as I can. So it's almost become like a second home for me. I have a very strong connection to that place. So in many ways that I think perhaps for many people I can be trusted to work there. Even if I still make mistakes, which I do, people are very forgiving of my mistakes and help me become a better researcher in that place.
Okay, the next question comes from Abdul. What is Mr. Peter's interest in research, and why does he have to go to Banda, even though there are many archaeological remains, especially in other Maluku areas? To Mr. Peter, time is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. I actually have worked in other Maluku areas a fair bit. So from Ambon, Saparua, Seram Island, K, the Watubela Islands, Tior, probably about maybe 8 or 9 different islands in Maluku. So I would love, if I had a longer life, I would like to work in many other different places too, because yeah, there's so much to learn from these places. I think even Banda, even though I've worked there for many years, there's still a lot to do there, and so I keep going back. Yeah, I wish I had more time.
Okay, maybe I'll give one last question if anyone would like to ask. Saya berikan pertanyaan terakhir jika ada yang ingin bertanya, sebelum saya menjawab lagi 2 pertanyaan dan menutup diskusi pada hari ini. Baik, saya akan mentranslate apa yang disampaikan oleh Mr. Peter. Pertanyaan pertama yang datang dari Nazmi, Mr. Peter mengatakan dari kendala-kendala yang ditemukan, dia lebih terkendala dalam berkomunikasi dengan orang-orang Banda karena dialek dan beberapa aksen yang terdengar masih tidak familiar untuk dia. Namun hal terbesar yang dia alami di sana juga, orang-orang di sana dan juga pemerintah di sana menjadi lebih otoriter, yang mana masyarakat di sana juga harus mematuhi beberapa hal dan juga tidak lebih leluasa seperti pada tahun-tahun sebelumnya. Nah, untuk jawaban ini itu mengatakan bahwa sudah berkunjung seperti Ambon, Pulau Seram, dan beberapa pulau di Maluku. Dan alasannya kenapa di Banda, karena beliau merasa tertarik di sana dan juga dapat mempelajari banyak hal yang ada di Banda sendiri. Oke. Oke, untuk KSB Lakuma, saya persilahkan untuk bertanya. Kumar, I ask you to turn on your microphone and started to speak.
Oke, terima kasih moderator. Saya pakai bahasa Indonesia, saya nggak begitu paham bahasa Inggris sih sebenarnya. Tetapi menarik sih apa yang dibahas tentang pala dan perubahan sosial yang terjadi di Banda. Jadi bicara tentang Banda berarti ada dua yang terlintas di benak saya. Jadi bagaimana Pulau Run yang apa ya, yang dijadikan tukar guling dengan Amsterdam. Saya ingin melihat sih dampak dari pertukaran ini. Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua, berbicara tentang pala berarti kita akan berbicara tentang perbudakan di 1700-an atau di abad ke pertengahan 18 sampai pertengahan abad ke-19. Nah, ini yang saya rasa belum seperti apa sih Pak Peter melihat tentang perbudakan di abad itu, dan bagaimana sih dampak dari perbudakan di Banda. Ya, terima kasih, mungkin dua itu saja sih.
Okay, thank you for Lakuma for the questions. Here I'm about to translate. So Mr. Peter, Lakuma have two questions. First, he asked the impact of this trade that you just present and deliver. And the second, he curious of what happened in the 19th century for the slaves that already worked for those long time. And so also he asking that what do you think and what the impact that people from Banda got after being a slave? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, or those two questions. So the impact of trade. I think one way to think about trade is that it's really about social connections. I mean, I think we often think about the movement of materials as being the most important thing, but really if you look at the impact, it's on our social networks. We go to the mall to buy whatever, food for the family or a new pillow for the bed, but we also go to the mall for social interactions, and those become actually our world. So going to the market, going to a store, these are social networks that influence our life much beyond just the objects that you buy in those places. So my work is looking at the kind of the social impacts of trade, so the bigger ways that it influences us. So that's what I'm really interested in right now in Maluku, is how were people in Banda connected socially to people in other parts of Maluku, and how did that influence the way they experienced the colonial impact? And I think there's a very interesting ways that political systems were shared across Maluku, the way Islam moved, all of that influenced kind of the foundation of society in Banda that then had to accommodate Dutch invaders. So this is really the root of my research, and I think your question is a very good one because it gets right at the very basics. So your second question, which was about the slaves or descendants of slaves in Banda, this is a very interesting one, and actually I think we need some young historians to do more work on this. One of my colleagues, who's the rector of a small university in Banda, has written a book about slavery in Banda. Very, very interesting, but it doesn't really investigate the how that still lives today, that inheritance. I think this would be an amazing, great research project that someone could take on. It's very sensitive because, of course, people often don't want to open up about history of slavery in their family. So it'd be difficult research to do, but I think it'd be very, very interesting and useful. So I hope maybe someone on this Zoom call would be interested in taking on that project. So, but thank you for those great questions.
Oke, thank you Mr. Peter. Jadi penyampaian dari Mr. Peter kepada Lakuma yaitu dampak yang dirasakan itu dampak koneksi sosial atau interaksi sosial yang mempengaruhi kita. Juga bagaimana perjalanan adat, budaya, perdagangan, dan agama Islam bisa masuk ke Banda. Memang sedikit sensitif jika kita berbicara tentang sejarah perbudakan. Namun hal ini menjadi salah satu minat dan daya tariknya untuk mempelajari lebih tentang perbudakan dan juga sejarah-sejarah yang ada di Banda atau di Maluku sendiri. Baik, itu dia penyampaiannya tadi. I ask a moment to mute for a while. Mr. Peter, there is one last question from Dina on the chat box. She asking that what is the most social change happened in Moluccas from colonial to democracy? And second, she asking what are the impacts of the Moluccas immigrant to Netherlands to social culture of Moluccas nowadays?
Okay, yeah, thank you for those questions, Dina. So the most social change from colonial times to democracy. I think that's a very interesting one. It's hard to choose one time period, one event or one thing in that time period because it was a very dynamic period. I think the Dutch East India Company goes bankrupt at a certain point in the 19th century, and then the Netherlands government basically takes over the operation of nutmeg plantations. And you start to see a shift in the kind of colonial policies during this time, all the way up until World War II to 1945, where there was kind of increasing development. So people in Banda, there was building of schools, there was a little bit of relaxing of some of the colonial policies that were very anti-indigenous people. And I think what you start to see as a result of that is a new generation of Bandanese, or more broadly Indonesian intellectuals. So the people who started the major universities in Indonesia are coming out of this time period. And that became very important during the wartime period. Those people became the leaders who inspired a young generation to think differently about colonialism. So I don't know if we can pick a certain point in that time period. It's really more of a process. But I think that opening up and allowing Indonesians to become more educated about European colonial politics allowed this shift that really resulted in Indonesian independence and Indonesia becoming its own nation. So now the second question that Dina asked is very interesting too, because of course probably many of you know that many people in Maluku migrated to Netherlands, particularly in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, and stayed there. And now, are coming back to visit. They still have family in Maluku. There's a lot of movement back and forth between these people within families. Now you have, the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of those immigrants who have been in the Netherlands for 3 generations, coming to visit Maluku as tourists and reconnecting with their families, people who never left. And I think that's it's very interesting. I think you're seeing influences back and forth there. There's a big influence of contemporary Maluku in Netherlands today. So in terms of politics, music, Ambon especially is a real center for really great music. And you see this influence back and forth between contemporary Dutch music or even global music, hip hop and heavy metal, moving back and forth. So I think this would be another really interesting place for someone who's interested in studying social change, to look at what's in 2023, what's happening, especially with the youth that are traveling back and forth between Netherlands and Maluku. A lot of Indonesians, of course, go to university in the Netherlands. So that's another place where you see this influence moving back and forth. So yeah, I'm always, when I go to Maluku and I go in the airport, I can usually tell if it's a person is a Dutch Indonesian or if they're not, by things like hairstyle or just clothing, attitude. So I think it's very interesting to look at those cultural influences back and forth. So anyway, thank you. Definitely outside of I'm an archaeologist. I dig holes in the ground and look at pottery. So I'm definitely not an expert in these areas, just interested. So thank you, great questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Peter. Jadi jawaban dari pertanyaan yang diberikan oleh Mr. Peter yakni dampak terkait dari pertanyaan yang pertama itu agak sulit karena sedikit dinamis. Namun mereka juga belajar banyak hal terkait intelektual orang-orang Banda. Hal ini menjadi salah satu crucial social change, perubahan sosial yang sangat krusial. Nah, untuk pertanyaan kedua, terkait imigrasi dari Indonesia ke Belanda, orang-orang yang berimigrasi itu masih tetap datang dan berkunjung ke Maluku, tapi sebagai turis. Nah, hal ini juga memberikan pengaruh yang besar dan dampak yang besar terhadap politik dan juga suara musik orang-orang dan berbagai hal lainnya. Namun tak lepas dari itu, banyak orang-orang di sana juga yang mulai terlihat hampir sama dengan orang-orang Belanda. Mungkin saja ini karena pengaruh dari DNA atau beberapa hal yang terjadi secara turun-menurun. Okay, Fahmi, please turn on your microphone and start to ask questions.
Oh, okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for Professor Peter for your contribution to archaeological study and findings, and also cultural discourse in our region, the Maluku Island. I'm so sorry if it's a little bit noisy here, and I think that some interesting point on Professor presentation is on the findings on obsidian. As far as I know, the William Solheim hypothesis on Nusantau culture that the obsidian traveled from the Papua as far as the northern Borneo region in the prehistoric period. So, should we redefine our maritime trading network from the European side to our point of view of historiography? Because we know that the spices history or spices trading network started from the colonial period, but as the professor stated before with his archaeological findings that there is or there are archaeological findings dating long before in the prehistoric period. So what is the further evidence or scientific research on this field so we can redefine our maritime trading network in the region? So we can draw a map that we have established long before our trading network in the region, not limited to the Maluku Islands, but also for the western side or the eastern side in Papua region, or as or borrow the terms from Roy Allen that Papua is the unknown world and Maluku is the border of Malay world and the Melanesian side. So should we redefine our maritime trading historiography nowadays for decolonization of our history? Thank you.
Thank you, Fahmi. What a great question. My answer is yes, absolutely. We need to redefine the maritime trading world. And you mentioned the findings of obsidian from the eastern side of New Guinea Island, found in Borneo. So that is very well documented. So over 5,000 kilometers of movement of obsidian from across the region. I think we have, you mentioned the Roy Allen's discussion of this kind of border between the Malay world and the Melanesian world. And that border has blinded us to connections that I think as you imply, we need to look at much more closely. Even though there's definitely a noticeable change of how people look and language and things like that as you move from Maluku to New Guinea Island. That was not a barrier or a wall of movement of people. There was people moving across that, and there's a lot of different evidence that supports that. I think many historians still don't think that way. They tend to look from Maluku towards Java and look for those connections. There's of course there are connections there, but they also go into Melanesia, up to Palau, and into the whole Austronesian speaking world of the Pacific. I think there's a lot of influence of Indonesian shipbuilding that shows up in Hawaii, Samoa, places like that. So one of my dreams is that Indonesia becomes more connected now in research to Melanesian and Austronesian speaking worlds, because that is part of the network that influenced what was happening. And I think the reason we haven't is, as you kind of implied, for colonial scholarship. And so part of a way to decolonize scholarship is to start to transgress those colonial borders that were instituted by colonial powers, in the 17th century, and break down those borders. So that might mean communicating with scholars, archaeologists, and historians who work in Papua New Guinea or Fiji or places like that. And there's some of that happening, and establishing more partnerships and collaborations. I think that's how we can break down and start to rethink this world. So yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. I think we agree with each other, and if I'm reading between the lines of your question, you know, I think this is a really interesting area to build on in the future, is to look at those new connections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Peter. Kepada partisipan, waktu sudah menunjukkan pukul 12:23 dan 7 menit lagi sudah akan selesai. So, participant, the time has shown 12:24 and not longer more, but we're about to closing. So maybe this is the end of the question and answer session. Next, I'll give to Mr. Peter to give the closing statement.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank the organizers and the leadership of the Development Study Club for bringing together this wonderful group of scholars and students. And it's been my honor to be able to talk to you today and learn from you. I'm still very much a student myself and learning every day. So I really enjoy meeting, especially with young scholars and students, and hearing your questions. And I wish I was there in person to meet you and spend more time with you, but maybe my next visit, we could meet in person. So I'll be in Jakarta in October, and Banda probably in end of October. So anyway, if there's a chance to meet up, I think I'm happy to share my email. I'm pretty easy to find, and feel free, any of you, to email me questions or comments. I'd love to talk to you. So it's been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate the honor to be here today, this morning. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Fahmi said, it will be great to meet Indonesia, Professor. Okay. Oke, sebelum tutup, saya mohon untuk para partisipan agar menyalakan kameranya, karena akan ada sesi dokumentasi bersama. So, to all participants, I'll ask kindly to turn on your camera, as we will open the documentation session. Or terkecuali nyalakan kameranya. Okay, there's still few of participants that still not turning on their camera. Masih ada beberapa partisipan yang belum menyalakan kameranya. Okay. Last. Himbauan terakhir kepada para partisipan yang belum menyalakan kamera, saya mohon untuk dinyalakan karena kita akan memulai sesi foto bersama atau dokumentasi. Okay. I think that's all. Oke. Dokumentasi diambil 3, 2, 1. Oke, next slide. 3, 2, 1. The next slide. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Mr. Peter, for attending to this discussion. It is really an honor for me to discuss with all of you. Sungguh sebuah kehormatan bagi saya bisa bertemu dengan teman-teman sekalian dan berbincang terkait sejarah-sejarah dan hal-hal antropologi lainnya. Oke. Mungkin dari pihak DSJ-nya sendiri ada penyampaian terakhir. Maybe from the DSC Team Development would like to giving their statement. May I please?
Thank you, Kak Rama. Terima kasih juga untuk Kak Sigi dan kawan-kawan.
Oke, kepada pihak DSC.
Thank you, Prof. Peter. I think that's all from us, and we hope you guys will still join us in our upcoming discussions. We still have more to present and more to introduce about any kind of topics about Indonesia, and maybe if Prof. Peter would like to join us too in the maybe in future discussions with us. We thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you so much. And maybe last, for the chairman of the HMT, would like to Oke, mungkin dari pihak HMT-nya sendiri, Kak Sigi.
Okay, thank you for Mr. Professor Peter for your discussion today. Dan juga terima kasih kepada teman-teman Development Study Club dan juga Kak Rahma yang bahasa Inggrisnya sangat baik dan bagus. Dan juga kepada seluruh audiens yang sejak di awal mengikuti sampai akhir. Terima kasih banyak. Dan juga Mr. Peter, again, thank you for your information. Dan juga kepada teman-teman development studi agar hal-hal positif kayak begini kita bisa laksanakan dan lanjutkan lagi ke sesi-sesi selanjutnya. Oke, terima kasih banyak teman-teman dari development studi dan Mr. Peter, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for the chairman of the HMT. Itulah tadi pembahasan kita terkait sejarah dan juga perubahan sosial yang terjadi di Maluku Utara. Saya Rahmatia, pamit undur diri. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. That's all for our discussion today about the history and the social change in Maluku Island. I'm Rahmatia. Thank you for all today.
Thank you. See you everyone.
Yeah.